Good
Yes,
evening,
we are live.
everyone. Uh, Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Bhabha. On behalf of the team Calcutta Comparities 1919, I take this privilege to warmly welcome you to the 60th lecture of this online lecture series. Calcutta Comparities 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of academic study of Indian languages and literatures. Envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. It is a platform for sharing research interests and ideas. We are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I feel honored and immense pleasure to introduce today's speaker. And he does not need any introduction, but for the formality of our forum, I take this honor to introduce him. Professor Homi K. Bhabha is an Indian English scholar and critical theorist. He is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities in the Departments of English and American Literature and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. He is also the director of Mahindra Humanities Center and the senior
No,
advisor.
sorry. I am not any longer the director. I stepped down after 14 years. So I'm not the director at the moment. I should have let you know that. I'm sorry.
My mistake, sir. My mistake.
No,
I'm so sorry. Okay,
I
so
had
he is
14
the
years,
senior.
and after 14 years, I stepped down. I founded it, and then I stepped down. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, sir. So he is the senior advisor on the humanities to the president and provost at Harvard. He has taught in many universities like Sussex, Princeton, Chicago, to name a few. He is one of the most important figures in contemporary post-colonial studies. Professor Bhabha is the author of numerous important books like The Location of Culture, Nation and Narration, Our Neighbors, Ourselves, The Black Savant, and The Dark Princess, to name a few. He received the Padma Bhushan Award in the field of literature and education from the Indian government in 2012 and Humboldt Research Award for his academic contribution in 2016. We are honored, sir, to have you in our forum. Now, I would request our coordinator, Arapchika Ganguly, to take over the mic and start this interactive session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemima. Thank you for this lovely introduction. And a very good morning to you, Professor Bhabha. And good morning, afternoon, good evening to all our participants and viewers, wherever you are in the world. So, Professor, should we start the interactive session now?
Please, thank you. Let me just say, I'm sorry, Jemima, to have interrupted, but I had to mention that I had stepped down from the directorship of the Mahindra Humanities Center, which I founded. I was the founding director. And also, in stepping down from that, I also stepped down after 14 years as the senior advisor, because I, had stepped down from the center. But otherwise, everything you said was absolutely accurate, very flattering, and thank you very much for inviting me. I think this is a remarkable group, and I'm very pleased to be interacting with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We are very honored to have you. And this is our 60th lecture, and we are hosting you today. So we cannot say how much thankful to you we are for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Aratrika. Thank you.
So, Professor, you have started your journey from Mumbai, and it was Bombay then, and then you went to London, to Chicago, to many places. So, how from Mumbai, a boy from Mumbai, how he got interacted, how he got interested in post-colonial theory? What made him got interested in this particular aspect of literary theories or criticism?
Well, I didn't start off I didn't start off with the availability of post-colonial theory as we know it today. Although, of course, it's a term which has many definitions and different takes on that definition, different formations in different parts of the world. But of course, this was not a term of art. It was not a term of criticism. It was not a school of theory. When I started working, I did English literature at Elphinstone College, which was a great education. And then I went to Oxford and I did English literature there. But when I had to write my dissertation, I decided to work on V.S. Naipaul. And V.S. Naipaul was a very controversial choice because, as you know, he was greatly admired, or he is greatly admired, very justifiably, by writers and by critics like myself. I greatly admire him. But many people from the post-colonial world at that time found that he was not sympathetic to the post-colonial cause, that they saw him as a kind of 19th century liberal. And I found that problem very fascinating. I found the conflict or the tension between admiring a writer profoundly for his vision, his insight, the richness of his perspectives, and yet having differences with that writer's politics and his views on history and society. And caught in this contradiction, when I started working on Naipaul, there was no post-colonial theory to appeal to, or to address, or to help in my own work. The available theories that were actually quite useful were the Marxist and structuralist theories of that time. That's how I got into this area. And then, of course, I discovered the work of Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak, who had been working in this area. And even at that time, Said was known for the work on Orientalism. I mean, the idea of post-coloniality emerged only later. So my own journey, which you asked me to talk about, started through English literature. But then when I started reading texts from the colonial world and the post-colonial world, I began to see that the kind of critical apparatus of European literary theory didn't quite answer the questions I was asking. It didn't look at the history of literature from the perspective that I wanted to. And Naipaul, for me, was very important. Because if you think of one of his most famous books, House for Mr. Biswas, you begin to see the tensions or paradoxes I'm talking about. Yeah. The book is avowedly a kind of Dickensian novel. Naipaul was a great admirer of Dickens, and he wrote effectively a 19th century Dickensian style of novel, full of anecdotes, full of characters, depth of perspective on the society of the Caribbean, Trinidad in particular, from which the novel came. It was saturated with the spirit of the 19th century novel, partly a historical novel, partly a novel of everyday life. But then but at the center of a 19th century novel is the notion of a hero. That's why they call it a Bildungsroman, a character whose biography, as it were, works through the novel, creating a sense of accommodation to his or her society, although there are moments of dissatisfaction with that society. But it's a novel at the end of the day, the Bildungsroman is a novel of coming to terms with your society, coming to terms with your fate. And here at the heart of this novel, you had this tragic comic character, Biswas, who could never feel who never felt accommodated. That's why the title, A House for Mr. Biswas.
Mm.
As you
How to
know,
Mr.
right
Biswas.
through the novel, he lives in various people's houses, he lives in, builds his own houses, but he never has a sense that he really belongs, that he has really been able to occupy a space that he feels at home in. And so I thought, how interesting that the formal apparatus of a Bildungsroman, or a 19th century European form, is being used to tell the story of a figure from the colonial world, a
Mm.
descendant of indentured labor, a novel which looks at slavery and indentured labor, huge forms of displacement and diasporic upheavals. After all, the families like the family that Naipaul describes came in the 1850s from India and settled in the Caribbean, and the Indian indentured laborers were also misfits between
Yeah.
the black slave society and the white slave owners. So these kinds of social and cultural conflicts made me think about what we then began to formulate as post-colonial critical thought.
So we can say like this was a very specific event or incident that actually led to a orientation towards this theory.
In my case, yes. I
Yeah,
remember
Naipaul's influence.
Yes, I remember a whole summer sitting in my room in Oxford trying to write my dissertation and not being able to find any theoretical framework which I could adopt, and therefore felt for myself at least that I needed to create a kind of an approach to this body of work. And then, of course, I extended it to look at a number of other problems, but also a number of other writers and artists. And so I've been writing about as much about artists as I do about writers, and my practice itself is very transdisciplinary and intersectional.
And thanks to that dissertation and that day in Oxford, that we now have location of culture and so many books by you.
Thank you
We
so
are
much.
yes, Professor, and we're on the connoisseurs of post-colonial theory now.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, and thanks to obviously V.S. Naipaul as well.
Thank you so much. You're very generous. Thank you.
And so coming back to our work, like how do you think our author's idea of and relationship with utopia gets shaped with the changing trajectories of post-colonial literature or literatures?
That's a very interesting question because I don't believe that in the main, the ideal of utopianism is the foundation of at least the post-colonial writers and thinkers that I myself, focus on or work with. I think, first of all, let's talk about utopia. When you have utopian thinking, you also almost naturally have dystopian thinking. Utopia and dystopia work
Yes,
together, they come together.
together.
So it's a kind of binary formation,
Yes,
utopia and
absolutely.
dystopia. And I think that the form of historical struggle, resistance, and survival that afflicts many post-colonial societies does not simply give them that privilege of either utopianism, which is a certain kind of historical vanity, however good it might be. It's a kind of, to assume that you can have a utopia depends upon a certain sense of sustainability, depends upon a certain confidence in the world. And dystopia sometimes can be an indulgence, that you think, everything is falling apart, and the two are continually balancing each other. I think that many parts of the world that I'm interested in and the literatures and art that I'm interested in are balanced somehow between the two. They are often, these writers come from countries, and in their work they reflect societies where the utopian ideal is very difficult to envisage. And because they have to survive on a day-to-day basis against the asymmetries of power, against forms of domination, against forms of oppression, they cannot afford to be dystopic. To put it in a metaphorical phrase, however melancholic, they have to get up and work. They have to do what they have to do. They've got to face reality. So I don't think utopia and dystopia are the major forms that I have detected in these fictions. Now, it is the case that in the moment, the immediate moments after anti-colonial struggle has succeeded, and you have developed and you have confronted your own freedom, the hour at midnight, as Nehru put it.
Yeah.
Then there are moments where you do feel that the whole future is yours, the world is yours. But as the great writer and thinker and political revolutionary Frantz Fanon was able to see very quickly, and Fanon has been a great influence in my own life and in my own work, as soon as you emerge into this world of what you think is freedom and autonomy, you begin to see the problems. You begin to see the problems outside, because as a new post-colonial independent country, you have suffered 200 years more of colonialism. You are yourselves, then you become dependent on the IMF, on the Washington Consensus, on huge loans to make your own, to rebuild your society, to shape it in the way in which you want it. So almost in the very moment at which freedom comes at midnight, you begin to see the high noon of difficult decisions and complex decisions. And particularly at that time, at that historical moment, you had a Cold War going on. So people had to either be, new nations either to align themselves with the socialist societies or with the capitalist liberal societies. You became a victim in their war, as much as you kept saying we're non-aligned nations. It was not realistic to be non-aligned. Just as, and Fanon also says, as soon as you begin to have a national bourgeoisie that is dependent on foreign aid, on foreign powers, then you also have a conflict of loyalty. You have corruption emerging into those systems, partly because they are systems that do not have their own economic sustainability, because that has been depleted through the years of the long years of colonialism. So these are very complicated situations, which is why I don't think the utopian and the dystopian are models that, in my view, have been illuminating for me. What has been illuminating for me is the way in which a lot of post-colonial literature has made very powerful critiques of the vanity of notions of Western progress, Western success, Western notions of consent, Western notions of citizenship, Western notions of sovereignty. Many diasporic writers, even as they immigrated to these great metropolitan centers, began to see the shortfall between what these once imperial metropolitan societies claimed for themselves and how they actually practiced the ideals on which they were based. So I see the notion of critique, both formal and ideological, as being very important. But more recently, in thinking about the space between utopia and dystopia, I've been quite persuaded by the ideas of Bloch and Adorno, who talked in the uh, post-Second World period of what they call disappointed hope. They said the current existential and political situation, and that's almost 70 years ago, and I think it's true now, is one of disappointed hope. We cannot help being hopeful because we try and construct our histories in a sense of solidarity, justice, fairness. So all that, the belief in human rights, the belief in human development, all that has to have a hope to sustain it. But at the same time, we know we will be despondent. We know we will fail. We cannot allow ourselves to fall into a kind of dystopian melancholy because we have failed. And we have to get up and work again. I mean, the work of politics is about every day stitching up the tears in society, just like the work of the scholar is every day writing a line and erasing the line and writing it again. These are ongoing processes. This is why this notion of disappointed hope in Bloch and Adorno is so powerful for me, because it is a call to resistance. It's a call to reworking the unjust and unequal systemic conditions of where you are. But at the same time, it is a warning that there will be disappointments and you cannot allow yourself to be passive. Disappointed hope is a form of agency, and we see it now in the lives of migrants. We see it in the lives of refugees. They take huge risks to emigrate from conditions that they find unlivable, economic, political. So refugees and migrants move because they have an optimism about life. They have a sense of hope. And then when they're put in detention centers, then when walls are erected to keep people out, when Dalits are Muslims are tainted with notions of not being patriots, etc. At that point, they understand that hope and disappointment go together, and we must somehow find energy in that opposition.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, in this context, I'd like to ask you a question. You talk about the idea of tribal nationalism, and how it is observed in by Hannah and Arendt in the origins of totalitarianism. In many of your talks, you have also discussed how I quote you actually, how tribal nationalism targets ethnicity, race, gender amongst population that are considered to be minorities. Targeting peoples as outsiders is part of this new tribal nationalist agenda to protect majorities against minorities. So, Professor, now in Indian politics, there is this emergence of slogans like you might have heard or maybe read somewhere, Hindu Khatre Mein Hai, which are very much trending and are used to get vote banks for a certain political party. And I mean, if we consider this through the lens of the emergence of tribal nationalism, should we be afraid about it? Or what can be the possible outcome if it in Indian politics as well in culture and society?
Look, Aratrika, you can speak with much greater authority about what's happening day to day in India than I can. But let me say that India is not alone, as you describe it.
Yeah.
Tribal nationalism, the term was coined by Hannah Arendt, and I'll talk about it in a minute.
Yeah.
Tribal nationalism now, or some people call it tribal nationalism, some people call it nationalist populism, some people call it ethnic nationalism. Yes, there are differences of emphasis, but I think all people who use these terms are referring to autocratic forms of government across the world today. If we talk about globalization, this is we are witnessing the globalization of international governance in most countries, where there are these leaders or in America at the moment, there's been a turn, and we don't have such a leader, although we have had such a leader for the last 4 years, and we don't know what the future is going to look like. But in each case, there are these autocratic leaders. But the question of tribal nationalism is the conversion of a majority through rhetoric, through fear, through racism, converting the majority into seeing themselves as threatened minorities. There is this reversal of perspective. Now, race is in the United States is a great way of doing this. It's to make the majority feel that the welfare state is basically catering only to minorities, to blacks, to Latinos and Latinas, to ethnic groups.
Yeah.
In other countries, there is a move to suggesting our legislations are so favorable to Muslims. And Dalits, these minorities have become the center of democratic political justice, and the majorities are suffering. Now, whatever the cases are, I want to make the general point that this is creating, through fear and through anxiety, a sense that majority populations, who are in the main powerful populations, are actually now threatened by minorities who are often economically disadvantaged, politically disadvantaged.
Very much.
And so this reversal of perspective is a very frightening issue. It's not only frightening politically, it's frightening morally. It can destroy the moral fiber of a country. What is even more problematic, in my view, is the way in which, in order to create this reversal, countries draw upon selective versions of their own histories. They try and emphasize the dominance and the purity of certain cultural traditions. You talk about the slogan that you just mentioned. And so there is a sense of saying, this is really purely a Hindu country. And some forms of Hinduism can be tolerant so long as you accept the hegemony of Hinduism as a tradition, as a culture, as a mode of belief, as a mode of custom. In the United States now, you have the other alternative saying what is called white supremacy. Of course, white supremacists sometimes say we are white supremacists, sometimes they don't. They say we are patriots. That is the new language. Yeah. But patriotism is often anti-Semitic. It is aimed against minorities, blacks, migrants, refugees, Mexicans. So the idea there being that you minorities are polluting the purity of our descent and our tradition. You are violating the very origins of our society, which actually has very little truth, either in theology or in history. And once you start doing that, once you start creating not only a political system, but a new hegemonic, nationalist, populist, ethnicist, a cultural system, it is very difficult to stop it. And it is extraordinarily dangerous. Yesterday on CNN, there was an excellent program by Fareed Zakaria and followed by Clive Anderson about the recent attack on the Capitol by what they called were national internal terrorist movements. And so the political violations of the Constitution, the political violations of the Capitol, symbolic violations are, people are saying, terrible. But what seems to me is that is even more problematic is conspiracy theory. This whole QAnon tradition using the social media to create
Yes.
panic, create fear, and create enemies. How you stop that, it's very difficult to know. How you stop vigilantes involved in love jihad, or how you stop vigilantes from going and claiming that there are people who are killing cows when they have not killed cows, and killing these people, after which it's impossible to prove. So please realize that whatever political systems we're talking about, as people who work in the humanities, we have to be extraordinarily vigilant against this kind of cultural movements, which interpret whatever they want in however they want to interpret it. And we humanists who teach interpretation, we students of the humanities who read texts or listen to music or listen to folklore and try and use interpretation to understand what is being asserted, we tend to have to ask ourselves, what is it that our educational system has done? What is it that our economic system has done, which allows people to believe, to put their faith in ideas that have very little basis in the historical record, if any, but we should not be arrogant. These people who stormed the Capitol put themselves in danger. They did it. They were wanting to create, to publicly act criminally. They were recorded. They knew that they would be followed by the CCTV. They gave interviews saying things which put themselves at harm because they so much believed what Mr. Trump and others said, which was that the election was stolen. That's only one instance. And I think this is one of the most dangerous things. Political parties may change, but once you let the genie out of the bottle, the genie of conspiracism out of the bottle, groups will form who do not even think politically. In fact, their thinking is based on conspiracies, on fabrications. But you know something that I thought about this morning? I've got to think more about it. Isn't it interesting that so many majorities around the world whose governments are in power, those majorities create these conspiracies, these alternative truths. But I have never seen African Americans en masse as a body, Black Americans. They were oppressed. They were slaves. Many of them are incarcerated. They don't produce conspiracy theories. They have their principles. They want certain forms of justice, but they don't have to make up conspiracy theories to make their claims to justice or fairness. Dalits don't make up conspiracy theories about their oppression to fight for their rights. Why is it that majorities who are represented by dominant parties need to create conspiracy theories which spread like poison? They spread like the pandemic, and there is no easy vaccine. There is no vaccination.
There will
Sorry,
be
I've
no
been going on
vaccination
for too long,
probably.
Aratrika, but
No,
I had
no,
to say.
Professor, it's absolutely okay. And yes, you're right. There is no vaccination for this, no cure at all. Maybe there is something wrong with our education system, something like wrong in our society itself. It's like a plague. It has been going on for ages and ages. So, like, there are incidents of, renaming places, roads, or demolishing of structures in India by the government. I can speak for my country. Maybe there are instances in other countries as well. In India, it has been like clearly like the Victoria Memorial has the it's a maybe it has been made by the colonial government, who were the British government, but it's a beautiful architectural structure. It has been renamed to a certain freedom fighter's name. And so this kind of things are going on every day in our country. So like, do you consider is as a part of claiming back the country, or a tyrannical charisma to represent majority and majority's right? Can it be discussed under the light of ethnic nationalism?
I think so. That's what I've been arguing. I'm saying that
Yeah.
this is a divisive, polarizing movement. And I think there are two reasons for it that we may not be able to explore today, but I'll put them out there. One, I think that our traditional notion of party politics is in the democratic system is really now failing most people.
Mhm.
Whether it is the Republicans and the Democrats, or whether it is the Congress and the BJP, and I could say this for many other countries too,
Yes.
somehow over a long period of time, and this is a complicated process, the nature of democratic politics has been reduced to you did X, therefore I'm free to do Y. It's as if everybody wants to play the political game and there are no common rules. Nobody is able to say, yes, I want to play cricket. There are two teams, but we know what the rules are. Here there is a continual corrupt decision to try and change the rules all the time in the name of the Constitution, and very often the courts participate in this. In the name of the Constitution. I'm not talking only about India, I'm talking about the United States. I live here, I can talk more about here.
Yes.
Although I hear what you're saying and I understand it and I read in the papers. So there is a way in which our own democratic parties have not actually spoken for the rich, complex, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic societies which we live in today. So I think there is a failure of the political party system, and that creates a kind of mob politics or movement politics on the left or on the right. And sometimes the movement politics is about establishing rights, and at other times, these mob or movement politics is about destroying rights and representations of people. I think this is one question, the weakness in the traditional party political system. The second issue, I feel, which that contributes to this, is the huge fall away of humanistic teaching and thinking in our universities, where there is so much emphasis on professionalism, on markets, and on
Yes.
STEM subjects, so that the humanities, which build their arguments not on and evaluate themselves, not on the basis of models, but on the basis of building communities, communities of scholars, communities of students who can argue, who have different perspectives, who are in a dialogue, who know how to deal with other ideas and somehow adopt some of them and reject others. This whole level of democratic conversation, democratic dialogue, which is so dependent on the humanities, is now neglected. And humanistic study, the ideas of sharing, of neighborliness, of political and ethical hospitality, these ideas have now become so devalued. While people talk about material success, meritocracy, financial success, that unfortunately we are in a very difficult situation. And every academic, I include myself, every teacher, every government that neglects humanistic education has a finger pointing at them, and I point the finger at myself too.
Yes, and from my own experience, like so you did your graduation from Elphinstone College, Mumbai.
Yes,
It's under University of Mumbai,
yes,
and the National Archives of Maharashtra. The Maharashtra State Archives. They're located inside the building.
I
So
know.
yes, I think 2 years ago I visited the archives, and I was sad and shocked to see the very dilapidated condition of the archives. Yet, I mean, the helpful nature of the workers there, let it brought back my faith that someday maybe the situation will change for good. So, and Professor, I read in one of your interviews that, obviously, like as you said, and also you stressed in that interview also how the great universities in Madras, Bombay, or Delhi are in supported the way this should be in a country where education is extraordinarily important, especially the humanistic teachings, as you said. So, relating your words with the condition of the archives inside your alma mater, do you think humanities and social sciences in India are more neglected because of the rise in this very narrow nationalistic ideas of nation?
I don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I read in the American papers about the fact that the museum, and of course, a museum is also an archive, that the museum that they
Mm-hmm.
have built outside the Taj Mahal, which was supposed to be about a museum of Islamic and Muslim culture, has now
Yeah.
been commandeered away from that. So, yes, to some extent, there are those interventions where archives are being nationalized. And as I say, a museum and its contents are part of the archival world of learning. But I think that this neglect of humanistic education, not simply in terms of the texts you read, but
Mm.
in the way in which you are taught, in the encouragement of pluralistic ideas and the dialogues and discussions that are necessary to create uh, cultural differences, that are necessary to live with tensions in complicated societies. There are always going to be tensions, and we have to learn how to negotiate them. I think all that predates, in my view, the current ethno-nationalist populist movements. I think this is a much earlier problem, and there are some very good Indian writers who have suggested that the Indian constitution is also so directed towards scientific thinking that the humanists, this is not my point, this is a very good point made by several others, that the humanistic framework of knowledge has never been as important as uh, uh, the scientific perspective. So I think this is a much earlier problem. This is a problem to do with the marketization of knowledge. It's a problem to do with how we think about meritocracy. It's a problem to do
Mhm.
with the sweep of technology. And technology is extremely important, but you cannot simply measure the success of your society by talking about technology on the one hand and markets on the other. Those are indicators of a certain success, but that's not the whole story.
Yes, and
Humanistic
mm,
education has suffered terribly. And that's
and
not only in India, by the way, in many other countries.
okay,
And in many wealthy countries where they could have afforded, in Europe, in the States, where they could have afforded to support it, they have chosen the path of technological and commercial meritocracy.
okay. It's very sad to see, and this is also pointing towards a very risky future regarding academia, and as you have said in other countries as well, not only in India but in the States and Europe as well.
Oh, yeah. I don't want to single out any one country. The country
Yes,
you live in, you suffer the the conditions in that country more vividly than in others. And those of us who live in or who are connected deeply to more than one country, we feel it across continents.
yes. And coming back to writings, maybe you can answer that from your own experiences or in a general sense. How do you think the writers who are writing stories about their homeland appeal the larger non-Indian readers in a Western country?
This is a very interesting idea. First of all, I think it's a good thing that at the cultural level, at the level of cultural production, artistic production, which is the subject of the question you put to me, West and non-West are much more now fluid categories.
Cultural like hybridity.
People move, artworks move, biennales are all over the world, book festivals are all over the world. I participate frequently in the Jaipur Literary Festival. It is the largest literary festival. People come from all over the world. So I think this perspective of West and non-West for, and I want to be very specific here, for English language writing is not a major issue anymore. There are all the Western publishers are in India. The Indian writers are all over the world. So true also of writers from Africa, from the Arab world. So there's a great conversation at that level of privilege. And as I say, one of the most important things here is translation. The ability to translate great Marathi works, great Bengali works that are being written now into languages are very important. Now, it is the skewed system we have. And it is a skewed system. It's an unfair system. It's an unjust system. But it is true for the moment, I think, that once you are translated into English, it's not in any European language. I'm saying once you're translated into English, you seem to have a global audience. This is not true of a German. I mean, you can be translated in German and French, or Italian, but you will not have that same. This really is part of the hegemonic legacy of empire. And it's amazing that this little island, which is shrinking day by day after it has come out of Brexit, this little mismanaged island of Great Britain does have this great language, which had a major colonial and imperial influence, but still continues in the 21st century to have this kind of global importance. It's one of the great cultural paradoxes. But it is true. But I think translation is very important. And I think something that is actually quite heartening, that in my own city of Bombay, Mumbai, many of the most interesting discussions are taking place at, say, the Goethe Institute there, the Max Muller Bhavan. Many people it's in my city and in Pune are actually studying German. When I go to Bombay, I'm very often hosted to give lectures and be part of discussions by the Max Muller Bhavan. Same is true in Delhi. Now, it's fascinating. You know, German is not a world language like English is.
Yes.
But I find that they are able to initiate discussions, which are often very compelling. That's, but that to me is a great compliment of India. India and my relatives, my family, my friends, my colleagues, I find are the most open-minded, free-thinking, challenging companions and conversationalists you can ever have. I find that about the energy, the intellectual energy, the cultural energy, the energy of social activism in the country is unbelievable. And it is also a country with very fine critical intelligence. Whether that critical intelligence manifests itself in art or in literature or in theater or in poetics or in dance, the richness of a challenging cultural environment in India, it's cosmopolitanism. It's a culture which is continually in transformation and translation. It is something that I absolutely live by. It has been the most formative. Living in Mumbai, being educated in India at that time was the most formative experience. And that's why I go back several times a year, not only to see my mother, but to see my friends, to immerse myself in the great stimulation of this great country. It is a country where people speak, and I'm talking metaphorically, in many languages. There are many frameworks of thought. It is a great country with a sharp, critical intelligence. And you will never be able to take this country and lock it in to one perspective. And then, however much that perspective is underwritten by power and hegemony, cannot be done in this country. There will be periods of huge suffering. But the great hospitality of ideas in this country, where hospitality, literally people take you into their homes, into their thoughts, into their hearts, the great tradition of hospitality, the great tradition of living as neighbors, although you may have different religions or different views. This is the richness of a country. And I believe sincerely, I hope I'm not wrong, that this spirit of solidarity, of hospitality, of the distribution of ideas, of the translation of traditions, can never be silenced, can never be locked up in quarantine.
Yes. Because as we say in our country, Atithi Devo Bhava, the guest is like a god.
And the guest is not only a person, the guest is an idea that comes from elsewhere. The guest is a belief that comes from elsewhere.
Yes.
Yes, Aratrika, I completely agree with you. That's a wonderful phrase.
Thank you, Professor. Uh, you have been living out of India for a long period of time, I guess, like since you left for Oxford. And in your opinion, you are also like, do you consider yourself as an Indian diasporic writer?
I can certainly consider myself as an Indian writer who has also lived and written in England and in the United States. I have taught in all these countries. Of course, I've taught more informally in India, but I lecture regularly there. I interact regularly. But I really don't want to claim that I'm an Indian writer, because I don't claim that I'm an English writer or an American writer. That's not the way I see myself.
But if we consider not speaking about you, but in general, how for the Indian diasporic writers are responsible for reorientalizing the Indian subcontinent? Do you think that it is inadvertent on the part of the writers to construct India as a negative alter ego of the Occident?
No, of course not. But I mean, I can't. I mean, some may do that, but many don't do that. So I really can't pursue this much further, because in my experience, I don't think diasporic writers necessarily reorientalize India. Some may do that. Some of them may do that. Some filmmakers may do that. But that's a problem that has to be dealt with specifically. I mean, you can also have Bollywood movies that re-exoticize India, right? And then you can have great
Yes.
Indian movies that show you things that you never saw before. So I really can't generalize on that issue.
Okay. And what do you think what role have diasporic intellectuals played in the institutionalization of post-colonial theory? Like, what are your opinions on this?
I think they've made huge contributions. They've changed many of the discourses around the world. They've shifted the focus of English literature much more towards the global South. Artists have done the same thing. Diasporic artists have done the same thing. Filmmakers have done the same thing. Historians, subaltern historians have done the same thing. I think there has been a huge flow of very productive ideas from the once colonized post-colonial world, the global South, right across the world. But they've changed the framework of, of of Western education, but they've also changed the framework of education in other parts of the world, Latin America, Australia. I think the contribution has been immense. And let us not be uh, diasporically nationalist. Let's be clear
Yes.
that we have been offered that, or we have been given that hospitality across the world. And I hope that in our country we will offer the same hospitality to writers who and from other parts of the
Yes.
world, to thinkers from other parts of the world who have accommodated us so generally and generously.
Yes, absolutely right, Professor. And like in this context, would you like to discuss about the prospects of post-colonial theory in India? Like, what's the future of it?
No, there are many great people who can do that in India. I think I might, the prospects are very bright, and they have been very bright for a long time. But I think that this is a question you should put to those who are actually teaching and arguing and writing in journalists in writing in the media in India. I think they're much better placed to answer that question.
Yes. Professor, moving on to a very important topic now, like migration and health, like, because migration is it's one of the most pertinent topic in our culture now. So, migration and health is being increasingly recognized as a global health priority. In this context, how do you assess the questions of displacement and global migration today? How can philosophy contribute into rethinking and redefining and resolving the issue of migration along with global public health?
Sorry, you were frozen. I couldn't hear the second part of your question. This is about health policy. I
Yes,
couldn't
like
hear.
how can philosophy contribute into rethinking, defining, and resolving the issue of migration along with like simultaneously with global public health?
Well, I mean, what is global public health about? Global public health is about reducing the risks that people have to face in living productive lives. That is the ethical basis of global public health, that there should be a distribution of knowledge, a redistribution of knowledge, as well as the distribution and redistribution of resources across the world. What do I mean by that? I was talking to one of the leading Indian scholars and practitioners of global public health, and I said, "What have been the great changes?" And he said, "The great changes recently have been South-South dialogues on public health, um, the public health debates in the West, which have been initiated by research and practice outside the West, the Western world, the Euro-American world." So I think that these readjustments, these redistributions of knowledge are extremely important at the academic level. At the practical level, I think I'm not a global health specialist, but at the practical level, I think there has to be a radical rethinking of the health system. I believe there is a new Lancet project, a new Lancet commission on global health in India, which has just been launched by several people, both working in India and working outside India. So I think these kinds of discussions and these kinds of programs and proposal help. I also think that the drug prices, generic drug issues are very important. I think the budgets given to local health centers across the world, and across the country. How do you distribute both expertise but also care? It's one thing to give somebody a prescription. It's another thing to follow up, to give people the kind of follow up and care that they need. So I think that global uh, public health is as important as an issue of global justice, because it is part of global justice. It is part of the responsibility of any government, and it is part of the responsibility of of governments across the board when they negotiate the price, for instance, of medicines or distribution. Um, uh, and I think that this is not simply a macro problem; it's a micro problem. It's also about how you create a network of care and health provision. I mean, the problem is very similar in the United States, which, as you know, that access to public health, which is, in my view, public justice for ethnic minorities, blacks, Native Americans, is very difficult. Of course, in America, there is the further problem of insurance, health insurance. But I'm not a public health specialist, so I'll just say this and move on from that.
Yes, and like as we were discussing before the session, like your mother is in Mumbai now, India, and you are in the States in Boston. So, and health, the vaccination, everything, the healthcare system, it's so different everywhere. So, like personally, how are you coping up with it, or like how are you like your mother is surviving this pandemic and everything? I mean, this health systems everywhere are it's so haphazard. It's not very much. I mean, very organized in any countries or any continents.
Yeah, they are haphazard, but if there is one thing the pandemic has taught us, is this: that those around the world who have the privilege of homes, the privilege of wealth, the privilege of family, are being able to quarantine themselves in relative safety. Those who are frontline workers, those who are essential workers, and they come mostly from either groups who are minorities, or they come from uh, uh, groups who are minorities who already have, because of their poverty, etc., who are already have diabetes or health issues. It seems to me that what we have been taught in the time of pandemic is that those who can secure ourselves safely are those with privilege, and those who are actually keeping these societies running, essential workers, frontline workers, are those whose lives are most at danger, not only now because of the pandemic, but because of the injustices, the social injustices of health systems.
Yes, the frontline workers, the doctors, the nurses, the policemen, and everyone. Like the working from home, it's a privilege now that we some of us
Absolutely so.
have.
My mother is privileged, I have to say, and that is why we've been able to survive.
Yes, sir. Many of us are really privileged. When we see the conditions of migrant workers, we really understand how privileged
Absolutely,
we are.
yeah, 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 yeah. So, Aratrika,
Yes,
you and I have
Professor.
been talking for over an hour, from what I can
Yes,
tell.
Professor.
I've enjoyed it greatly. Do you want to bring in some questions? Because soon our time will be done. How do you want to proceed? I leave it to the Calcutta comparatists to guide me in this matter.
Yes, Professor. Yes, Professor. We'll certainly love taking questions from our audience. I can see there are many questions from our audience. Now we have Kingshuk, Afroz, Arif, and Jemima with us.
Yeah.
Kingshuk will show us some of the questions. Please, Kingshuk, if you can show us the questions in the screen, then Professor can also read the questions.
No, you
Actually,
choose
I,
for me. Please
Also,
choose for
I
me.
would like.
Yeah, I don't want to
Yes, yes,
necessarily read the.
we
You
will choose
just
it
choose
for
for me
Professor.
whatever you think is relevant and
No, no,
important.
Professor.
yes,
Yes,
actually,
Professor.
Professor, there are so many questions and comments. We obviously can't show all of them. So we have selected some of the questions. I would request Jemima to please read out the questions for Professor. Jemima, are you here?
No, she's muted.
Uh, I think she's facing some
Uh,
internet trouble.
Oh
yes,
yeah.
I think so.
Yes, Kingshuk, if you can show it, I will read it out for
Yes,
Professor.
yes, I'm just.
And we have so many viewers, and sorry for not taking up all the questions. As you know, we are very much short of time here. But thank you all
Aratika,
for your lovely questions and comments.
Thank you. I fully
yes,
understand.
yes, yes. Aratika,
Yes,
shall I read it out? The questions?
you can show it as well. Yes,
No, actually, I have the questions
yes, please,
noted
Kinshu, read
down.
it out.
So, okay, okay. There
Yes,
is a
sure.
question,
Kinshu, please read it.
sir. Can we include LGBT, Dalit, and subaltern writings under the appellation Fourth World Literature?
I believe so. I'm fully in um, uh, agreement with the question. I think I have not talked enough about the LGBTQ issues because I've thought about it very much in terms of a minority discourse. So let me say that immediately and acknowledge that, because didn't give me enough time to go through various forms of minoritization. But I think that this is
Yes,
a very important category and a very important question. I'm fully in agreement.
yes, Kinshu.
Yes, Professor,
Will you read
thank you. There is another question by Sachin Singh. In democracy, what can be a substitute for party politics?
It's an excellent question. I wish I knew, I wish I had a satisfactory answer to that. And the question is a very clever one, because democratic politics depends on representation. It depends on a whole process where people are mandated and where they represent their region, or they represent their city, or they represent their taluka, or they represent the constituency. So I think the question of representation is very important in any democratic system. Now, I don't know whether parties can be substituted by other formations. I think what I think, looking at the world now, is that when you begin to have movements developing, some of them are progressive, some of them are not progressive. When you have movements that have lost the faith in the party system, then I think it is a sign that these large parties have become sclerotic. They have lost their own energy. And you can see it. You can see this. At least for the moment, you can see that, for instance, in the United States, the Democratic parties and the Democratic forces all came together to get Trump out, and they succeeded. It was a large popular vote in favor of Biden. But there are different parts of the party. There is the more progressive left-wing parts. There are the more traditional centrist parts. I think that instead of thinking it a complete outside the Democratic Party, it's what are you left with? One-party states, or states with, you can have several parties and negotiate it, but that fate is also not often very productive. I think that there has to be much greater democracy within democratic political parties. I think one of the problems is how the power base, whether it's a liberal party or whether it's a conservative party, the leadership has to be much more open to transformation within the party itself as society changes. So I can't think of an immediate answer to that excellent question. I can't think of a solution in democratic terms. What I am saying is that one of the problems we have today is that the notion of the common good, which is the responsibility of large parties to establish. Sometimes they do it by citing the Constitution. Other times they do it by citing laws. Other times they do it by citing landmark cases which have created for a society cohesive common good. So I think parties have to be much more focused on that. And one way of being focused on the common good is to have democratic freedom within parties and to have systems of election, systems of voting within parties, which are much more equitable than what we have today. It's an excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Professor.
Professor.
We have our next question from Shagata Khan. He writes, do you think that the scholars of post-colonial studies form an orbit of academia that is set apart from the rest of humanities academia?
No, I don't think so. And I go back to my earlier question that post-colonial studies has changed the gravity in, as far as I can tell, in literary studies, in studies around urbanism, in history, in anthropology, and I think it's a very good thing that that has happened. It's not the only game in town, but it is a game that has introduced new rules into several disciplines.
Thank you, sir. We
Thank
have
you,
our
sir.
next question from Nilanjan Chakraborty. He's writing, do you think that the rise of majoritarian politics is because the liberal left remained silent in some issues pertaining to marginalization of some sections of the population?
I think that that is a question that to which the answer has to be yes or perhaps, but I think it's difficult to answer that question without asking my honored questioner which sections he's actually referring to and what the particular perspectives are that he's referring to. Can I use this moment just to say something that I meant to say and I haven't said, which is that the media generally, and by this I mean both the traditional media and social media, play a huge part in the construction of public opinion, in the construction of fear, hope, disappointment, and anxiety. And it seems to me that in order to have a free media and a productive media, not just a media that anybody can say anything, we have to be able to take reasonable dissent very seriously. You can't tamper down dissent. You can't censor. But in order to do that, I think we have to have responsible and responsive media that know that their job is not only to give the news in as sensational or as dramatic a way as possible, but they've got to understand that they are in the process of constructing democratic constituencies, and they have a huge responsibility to negotiate different views and to be able to bring people together, even though they have different views, different beliefs, and different ideologies. I think the media is a kind of extra, it has to have an ethical sense and a sense of justice at the forefront of it.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Professor.
much, Professor.
Uh,
If you permit, sir, we can take our next question. That is from Pooja Banerjee.
Yeah.
Okay. She writes, Professor, kindly talk about the bulldozing of regional languages in the erstwhile colonies in favor of English. How can the future generations be made aware of the importance of regional languages?
I think the assumption here is absolutely right. Regional languages were bulldozed. I think I alluded to this earlier when I said that it is both paradoxical and yet in a way it's an obstacle and yet something that is enabling and an obstacle that English still has such a dominance across the world although the small island of Great Britain is in real peril and trouble. And I think it has to be read in terms of its earlier imperial power. And also, I think, to be fair, in post-imperial times, the English publishers, the English language has been open to a number of liberal perspectives. So I think that I want to clarify that. As an industry, it has been enabling just as much as the English language has been imperial. Having said that, I think that this question is a very important one, which is why I said that forms of translation are absolutely crucial. And once you begin to have the back and forth of translation, I think regional languages develop a larger and important profile, which they absolutely have to do.
Thank you,
Thank you, sir.
Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor, do you have time for one last question?
Yes, I'll take one last question.
Thank you, Professor. It is from Dr. Nirmal Pramanik. Dr. Pramanik is asking, post-colonial studies largely refer texts written in colonial period by the colonized, and those texts are apparently progressive and anti-colonial. But Indian Bhasha literature hardly talks about post-colonialism. Do you think post-colonial studies has its appeal beyond English academia at all?
I I I defer to my questioner. Um, I can't answer that in any satisfactory and fair way. At least in the countries that I travel in, and amongst the people I meet, because you don't always meet the whole nation. You meet certain groups of people, whether it's in India, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Australia or Europe. These are the countries, and the United States. These are the countries I know. I have to say that there's been a great interest in post-colonial thinking. But of course, in each country, it's different. It translates differently. It plays differently. The structure of society is different. The structure of public justice is different. The institutional availabilities of educational institutions, media are different. So in each place, the soil is different. The air is different. But having said that, I've more or less concluded a year and a half long uh, 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 research project supported by the Mellon Foundation and the Volkswagen Foundation to think about a global humanities curriculum. And for that, we had workshops in Africa, we had workshops in Latin America, we had workshops in Europe and the United States. We were going to have a workshop in India, but then we had the pandemic issue and we couldn't do it. I have to say that in all these countries, I have seen the impact of what we call post-colonial thinking, but at this, what I want to stress at the same time is that in each of these locations, there were several changes, transformations of the paradigms, translations of the concepts. So I think that I'm confident in saying that there's been a significant impact. I can't, of course, speak for every form of education or every form of institution. So much depends on what resources you have. So much depends on whether students and academics have the time to do the research or to read or the facilities. So I will not take this question at its fullest, because I think the granular details are absolutely determining. And so I don't want to make a generalization. I
Thank
can
you,
only speak
Professor.
from my own experience.
Thank you, Professor. Um,
Thank
Before
you.
ending this session, King Shuk, Jemima, Arif, Afroz, if any of you has anything to say to Professor. Arif, Afroz, yes.
Yes, Arif.
Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful experience. It was an experience listening to you, and I have read your books
Yes,
also. But
absolutely.
yeah, but listening to you, that was a whole another experience, and we loved it entirely. And like we got to see newer perspectives and all. So we are very much thankful for that.
Thank you, my dear Arif. Thanks all of you. Ratrika, Kingshuk, Afroz, Arif, and Jemima, and the audience. Thank the audience. I want to thank the audience for giving me your time today. I'm
Uh,
absolutely delighted and
sure.
energized by your presence. Thank you.
So
Thank you.
same here. So should we conclude with an with official vote of thanks, if you permit?
Of course, please.
On behalf of Calcutta Comparative 1919 and its members, I would like to convey our hearty thanks to Professor Homi K. Bhabha for this excellent session. A big thank you to you, Professor, for sharing your ideas and views with us and our participants. I would like to express our gratitude to you for responding to us and coming to our forum. I would like to thank our team members for helping us in making today's questionnaire and supporting us in every possible aspect. Thanks to all our audience on YouTube for being with us today. Here we officially conclude this session now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Bhabha, for this amazing, insightful session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well,
It's an
once we
honor
get
listening to you.
thank you. Once we get
It's
off
a,
the air, I'd like to talk to you. Just
Yes,
once you.
Professor.
definitely.
Absolutely. Absolutely,
Definitely.
Professor.
Yeah.
So have we? Are we
Okay, so,
now just amongst?
yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm ending this broadcast officially.
Thank you.
Ending them broad. Thanks.